Hello, Namaskar, welcome to my pod, the CAA Show. CAA, as all of you know, is Conversations and Analysis, and my name is Juggi Bhasin. There is one term which keeps popping up in podcasts all over the world, be it in India or internationally, and surely that term is deep state. Just about everyone is talking about the deep state. In India, we talk of the deep state when we refer to the American deep state, which, within quotes, is supposedly interfering in India. So, today in this podcast, I'm going to examine whether this deep state A, does it even exist? And if it exists, then why is it inimically opposed to India? What exactly is it doing in India? I'm going to talk about all that, but first I would try and understand the larger contours of this deep state. And before I even get into that, as always, I would urge all of you to, of course, to subscribe to my channel, the CAA Show. Subscription is, of course, completely free. All you have to do is to press that red button on your screen to become a subscriber. Would also appreciate if you could like the show and share this video with your friends, colleagues, and peers. Okay, let's dive back right back into this very, very interesting subject. What exactly is this deep state? Now, I was listening to a very interesting podcast. These people who do this podcast are my favorite podcasters in the world. They are called the All In Podcast. It is known as the All In Podcast. It is anchored by David Sachs. And they were doing a summit in the US of where they invited eminent speakers to speak at their summit, something on the lines of what you have the Times of India Summit, the India Today Summit, the Hindustan Times Summit, Economic Times Summit, that kind of a summit. And there were these two very eminent intellectuals, authors, political scientists, and certainly professors of very eminent colleges who had come and who gave the definition of deep state. These two gentlemen were John Mearsheimer, who was a professor at the University of Chicago, and then there was Jeffrey Sachs, the famous Jeffrey Sachs, who was a professor at Columbia University. And they were asked about the deep state, and they confirmed that yes, there is, of course, a deep state in the United States. It's been in existence for number of years, especially after 1991. It has been in constant activities going on in the deep state. And they gave a very brilliant analysis at what the deep state in America really does. The point they were making was that the deep state is actually to that extent regime agnostic. It does not matter to the deep state whether the regime is a Republican regime or whether it is a democratic regime. What really matters to the deep state are the projection of American power. That is the goal. That is the raison d'etre, which is the reason for existence of the deep state, and that is to project American power. And you would be wondering that then who is the deep state? Is there some kind of a branch of the US government or who exactly are these people? And I'll give you the answer for that also. The deep state people are very essentially bureaucrats. A lot of these bureaucrats are in the Department of State in the United States. They are also members of the intelligence community. Some of them could also be in the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. And they're also deep state actors are also found in some of the policy groups, some of the think tank groups in Washington and other think tanks which are important American think tanks which are spread across the world. So deep state actors are found in all these institutions. And therefore, both the professors concurred. They were of the opinion that deep state continues its activities irrespective of who the president of the United States is. And they give an example. When President Trump when he was in power, and we all know President Trump by nature is an isolationist. His slogan is that of Make America Great Again. His policies, economic policies, even his international policies are to that extent inward looking. What really concerns America is his priority. And therefore, one would imagine that the deep state would kind of wither and die during his tenure, because it would probably be more suitable for if the Democrats were in power, but not really. The deep state survived that. There was no purge or anything. They continued as before, and proves the point of the two professors that irrespective of the regime, irrespective of whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, the deep state continues its activities in America. So that is, I'm giving you these pointers to give you a broader, to give you broad contours of what the deep state is all about, what is its mission statement, who are the people who make up the deep state. I think we have some answers to that. And therefore, in a certain sense, it is like the old imperialists of old, which project power. They want to project American power. They want states to be client states, subservient states to them. They want to project American power at all costs. Actually, that is really the primary function of the deep state. And therefore, it begs the other question that when there is a particular president in the United States who might be whichever way ideologically inclined, and therefore is the deep state works in tandem with that president, or does it work as a support group in the presidency, or does it work as an advisory group in the presidency, or does it even work as in an adversarial capability during that presidency? Because it's not necessarily that the bureaucrats or the members of the deep state might be ideologically or theoretically on alignment with the president. So can it work adversarially also? These are the four different parameters we were thinking of the deep state. Do they work in these manners? And the short answer to all these four questions is that all four possibilities can happen when a president takes over. They can work in either of these capacities. They can be in close contact, they can be in proximity, they can work in tandem, they can work as a support group, they can work as an advisory group, or certainly, and they can work even as sometimes as an adversary also. And therefore, it shows, if nothing else, the extent and the reach of the deep state, that come what may, whatever the circumstances, the deep state remains entrenched. It remains, it works, as I say, behind the scenes. It is undercover, but it is working silently, ruthlessly, efficiently, all the time. So we need to keep that in mind. The other question which props up when we are talking of the deep state is, does the deep state have synergies with very interesting non-state actors? And I'll give you three names. These three names, we are familiar with all the three names, and then we will we will try and understand that how does the deep state work with them. The first name which I'm giving you is the name of George Soros. George Soros, of course, you know, is that eccentric billionaire who makes it a point to interfere in many countries in the world, and one of his pet projects is also to interfere in India, to bring about a regime change in India. That part is, of course, correct. This is not speculation. The other name is Pannu. Pannu is that terrorist in the making, or who already is probably a confirmed terrorist by now, the Khalistani Pannu. And the third name which I'm giving you is that of Hindenburg, who we all know has tried to attack the Indian stock markets, who has tried to bring down the Adani group, who actually has almost succeeded to a certain extent in making a run for money, you know, in speculative activities. In futures and that kind of a thing. I'm taking these three names. There will be, of course, hundreds of other names, but these three names are important to us. They're pertinent to us because all three names are names of people who are adversarial to India. These are people who actually go all out are detrimental to the interests and to the welfare and to the growth of India. And therefore, the question which I'm asking is, does the deep state work in tandem Does it have synergies with these non-state actors? And you would be wondering that are they not really the deep state? The short answer is again no. They're not really the deep state. They can become the deep state at certain times. At other times, they remain on the outside. And I'll give you an example for that. Somebody like a George Soros, for instance. Even by the standards of the State Department, even by the standards of the present dispensation in the United States government, which is to some extent has these socialistic leftist tendencies, woke tendencies, of course. George Soros is ultra Islamist leftist. And I'm not sure that his philosophy would also be palatable to everyone in the Department of State in the US. So at times there could be a kind of a convergence of interest between George Soros and the Department of State, but not all the time. So that's one thing we need to understand, that there is a tie-up or a link-up, but not all the time between these characters. Panu. Panu, of course, a lot of people feel like is a CIA asset. I'm not sure about that. He could be. But he definitely enjoys some kind of a patronage or protection because the Indian government has, short of giving demarches or short of, asking that he should be sent back to India to stand trial for so many offenses, he's a man who's well protected. And now the latest thing is, as we know, that he has filed this petition in the US court, and the US court is trying to summon the Indian government and Doval and other people in the Indian government. So Panu is a nuisance maker, if nothing else. We feel he's a terrorist. And then the third character, Hindenburg. Hindenburg actually, in a certain sense, is even more dangerous because he almost succeeded in wiping out substantial profits, in wiping out substantial assets in the Indian stock market. It was almost like a raid which he had almost succeeded. But he was, of course, stopped in his tracks. I personally feel, is the most dangerous character among all three of them. So the deep state finds convergences, finds alignments with such individuals, also people who remain on the periphery, people who remain what I call in the gray zone, people India certainly is not very comfortable with. So these kind of characters, these kind of people are also people who are kind of in and out of the deep state. So if you were to sum up the overall world international situation of the deep state, then here's what I think what the deep state really is doing is that the deep state does not have the capability, it is not interested, it does not go in for what I call naked aggression. That is boots on the ground, armed attacks. Those are the jobs of armies, those are the job of nation states. But what the deep state really does, it creates the grounds for aggression, for a regime change, for a new order to be ushered in. That is what the deep state does. So in a way, it is actually what the job the deep state is doing is even more important, but it is even more stealthy, it is even more dangerous, it is even more significant actually from that point of view, and therefore it lays the ground for all these things to follow. And therefore what the deep state is really doing is that it is what I call, it is infiltrating and subverting institutions, groups, communities and individuals in the world, especially in our part of the world, that is in India. I'll repeat it again. The deep state infiltrates and subverts institutions, groups, communities, and individuals in across the world. It is probably doing that in India also. And here is the irony. Here is the biggest irony in this entire equation. The political leadership might decide on a particular course of action. And I'll give you a very interesting example. The rapport, the understanding between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi, for instance, is real. This is not something which is make-believe or something which is put on for the cameras, that bonhomie, that friendliness, the warmth which they exude when they meet each other was actually very real. And if you remember the state visit of the Prime Minister to President Biden last year, and there were a lot of agreements and everything, but now, as time went by, most of those agreements are stuck. They have not been moving forward. We know about the GE engines, nothing has been happening on that. The Predator drones, that particular deal is also stuck in a certain sense. And therefore, if you remember the timeline last year, the two leaders met at the G20 summit in Delhi, and there was this bonhomie, there were these expressions and support, and everything all was hunky dory, as we say. And literally a month later, the Pannu issue exploded, and India US relations actually went back. They were again on the back burner. And the question has to be asked is that how did that happen? Who sparked all that? Who was behind all that? And then the suspicion of needle, the needle of suspicion, as we say, then starts swinging towards the deep state. And the Pannu issue then becomes a kind of a issue which is then used by regular intervals by the deep state to keep pressurizing India. There is no easy resolution to the Pannu issue because there is no way that the Indian government can surrender its intelligence assets to the United States on this so-called whatever assassination plot. And therefore the US knows it, India also knows it, and yet this problem keeps continuing. This back and forth keeps going between both the countries. And that is an example, therefore, that whatever is decided at the top, the follow-up doesn't happen below, because below it's the bureaucrats, it is the intelligence community, it is these officials who actually ensure the flow of events. That has not been happening, and therefore this contradiction is very, very clear between both the countries. Now, this is the overview of the deep state. Let's take now a look at why is the deep state then so particularly interested in India. We need to understand that. Even before I talk about that, the fact is there is now ample proof that there has been some involvement of the deep state in the changes, in the regime changes which have occurred both in Pakistan and in Bangladesh. No question about that. So let's keep that in mind. Now, why are they interested in India? Or rather, why are they going out against the Indian government in India? Too much has been written about, too much has been talked about the interference of the deep state. I don't want to go into great details about that, but I'll still raise a few salient points. But let's first try and understand what exactly is the reason why the deep state has this animus against the present dispensation in New Delhi. And the reason is very simple. As I said, the original charter of the deep state is projection of American power. And therefore, what the deep state would really love to see in today's day and context would be that India becomes like another Ukraine and it takes on China, the way Ukraine has taken on Russia. And even though we know that Russia eventually has probably already won the war, is going to win the war, whatever, but Russia still has taken a great knocking. And the US, honestly, to that extent, hasn't really lost any boots on the ground. Yes, it has spent a lot of money, but they have hurt Russia. And wouldn't the deep state love it that India could do the same to China? That's the thing we need to understand. If India can launch these periodic attacks, whether in the Himalayan borders or whether in the Malacca Straits or whether in the Indian Ocean, the Navy, the Americans would love it. It serves the purpose of the American deep state, of the projection of which they want to make. That that Indian armed forces power is utilized to keep China in check. And that is what the ultimate goal, the goal of the deep state is, to keep both Russia and China in check. Sorry. And the only way, and the only way, or the only entity, I would say, or the only country which has the capability to do that to China and this entire, on the entire world map, is actually only India. India can create real problems for China, and this is what probably the deep state is thinking, or they would love India to do. But India is not doing that. Okay, India follows the concept of what we call strategic autonomy, where it decides for itself who are its friends, who are its partners, whether it wants to be aggressive, it wants to be friendly. That is India's policy, and this deeply frustrates the deep state. And therefore, the deep state has launched, maybe, and that is, and I'm building this entire theory also, which might be actually rooted in some facts, in some reality also, that the deep state therefore has launched these operations in India, where at one level it is engaging with the opposition in this country. At another level, they are trying to work the intelligentsia, work the intellectual class in the country, the younger people in the country, bring them over to their side on the premise of freedom of speech, democracy, all these other very interesting, high sounding, ideas. And the idea is to put pressure on the Indian government that it eventually starts towing the line. And that is the real answer why the deep state has a problem with the present dispensation and has launched activities which are detrimental to the Indian interest. Because really, this is what the deep state would love to see: a projection of American power at the expense of Russia, at the expense of China, and also at the expense of India for that matter. So, in other words, India actually then, in that sense, then is like a client state which does whatever the forces out there ask it to do. It, of course, the superior state, that is America, supplies you with technology, with weapons, with all that. But then you have to do the bidding, you have to do the work which they ask you to do. And as it happens right now, at least, the Indian government is not prepared to do that. And here's my other theory, which I would like to project, that there is this assumption that the opposition might be more amenable to all this. I'm not too sure about that. Tomorrow, supposing even if the opposition were to come to power in India, let's say after a few years, I'm not too sure that they can follow the deep state dictums to the letter. They would go the whole hog of what the deep state wants from them. I don't think so that is possible in India. India is too deep, too complex. It is too diverse a country for this kind of a thing to happen. And therefore, we have this attrition which is constantly going on with the deep state. Now, how does the deep state do all this? Let's try and understand that also. The deep state does that because of this body which it has in the Department of State. It is called the USCIRF, that is the US Commission of International Religious Freedom. And this body brings out reports on religious freedom year after year, and every year they bring out reports which are detrimental to India. The US ambassador at large of the USCIRF is a person called Rashad Hussain, who's of Indian origin, by the way. And this report, the last report, blamed India, faulted the Indian police, and that 75% of hate speeches were happening in BJP-ruled states. Demolitions of homes and religious places and minorities was taking place constantly. And here's the irony which I see when these reports are tabled by the USCIRF. The head of the Department of State, we all know, is of course Anthony Blinken. Anthony Blinken is a Jew. George Soros, the billionaire who has this agenda against India, is again a Jew. New York Times, again a newspaper which is completely has this antipathy, it is detrimental to India. It writes article after article against India. The proprietors of the New York Times are Jews. It boggles the imagination. I can't understand this. But all such people subscribe to what I would only say is some kind of an Islamist leftist agenda. And again, this is one of those ironies which I wanted to point out in this podcast. Then there are these characters in the Department of State, which India is not particularly fond of. See, Anthony Blinken is not in that category because honestly, I think our Foreign Minister Jaishankar and Anthony Blinken get along very famously. There's no question about it. Those snapshots we keep seeing and all that are for real. They actually have a wonderful understanding, and sometimes it does happen also that the man on the top, there is only so much which he knows or whatever is happening below him. Maybe he can't even control the flow of events what are happening below him. So let's give the benefit of doubt to Mr. Anthony Blinken. But the other person I'm going to talk about, Nick Victoria Newland, is somebody who a lot of people feel is this completely, dangerous character. She's no longer. She used to be Under Secretary of State in some time back, but she's left that now. But I think she and her family, some relatives they are part of these think tank bodies in Washington, which are very, very influential. And then she's definitely a very integral part of the deep state. And it is reputed that she was the one who brought about the regime change in Bangladesh. And earlier, of course, she is the famous person who brought about all those changes, the regime changes in Ukraine. So Victoria Newland is somebody we are very careful about. Then another person called Richard Verma, Deputy Secretary of State. He's not particularly anti-Indian, I would say, but he's not pro-Indian also. So he's somebody, again, we are a little cagey about. Then this gentleman called Donald Du. He's the Assistant Secretary of State. Again, a person the Indian establishment, I feel, is not very, very comfortable with. We kind of are a little suspicious of the gentleman. And then these two characters who are in the Department of State, Uzra Zaya, Under Secretary of State for Human Rights, and she's, by the way, of Indian origin from Bihar, and she is rabidly anti-Indian, no question about it. This lady is completely rabidly anti-Indian. And the other name, the name which I had given to you earlier, who's the ambassador at large of the US CIRF, that is Rashad Hussain, who again, he doesn't really inspire confidence in India. So these are some of the characters who are there in that department. They could call them members of the deep state. They're not particularly inclined towards India. I've given you the reasons why that they could be inimically opposed to us. We don't toe the line. We don't follow the line. We don't behave like a client state. We have our problems with China, but we want to deal with China the way we want to, not the way we are told to follow or to deal with China. We can't be as proxies for somebody else to put pressure on China. That's not the end game in India, certainly. So that's why the deep state is not particularly happy with India. And then in summation, let's talk about the real problem which the deep state can actually create for us in India. I personally don't think that, graying, pot-bellied bureaucrats can trouble India so much. I mean, people talk of policy and theories all the time. Fine, you can go to seminars, you can do this think tanks, you can raise all these issues, that's all fine. They can do some damage, but not so much of damage, because by and large, these things don't affect the normal population. What really matters, and something which now the deep state is using very, very efficiently, is the dominance of tech companies, the dominance of technology, which again is something which the young in India always aspire towards. I'll just give you an example, a very interesting example. Only I think a couple of days back, the Apple iPhone 16 was launched. And you had to see the lines of people who were queuing up to get their Apple iPhone 16 from Saket, and that is in Delhi, and from and I think in Bombay also. And Apple is, of course, doing very, very well in India. The point I'm making is that the deep state understands this. They understand that technology, they understand that communication, they understand that entertainment, These are the new, within quotes, I'm using this word deliberately, sexy parameters. These are the alluring parameters which are snapped up by the young, by people who might not even understand the depths or the details of how these deep state, etc., things keep working. They want these things. And through the medium of, as I said, tech, we saw that in the last elections, in the 2024 elections, how social media, how influencers were used to propagate against a particular regime. We have seen that happening. And the sense of mobilization, the sense of protest, which can lead to anarchy and sometimes even to violence. All these are interlinked with modern forms of tech, modern forms of communication, modern forms of entertainment. All these things are interconnected. And this is where the deep state has come right in the middle. It is orchestrating. It is like a conductor. A conductor orchestrates. A conductor actually through his baton. The orchestra runs on that, as we know. And like that, the deep state is orchestrating all these developments. These are worrying developments. These kind of societal, sociological changes are taking place already in India. As I said, the young are always gullible to a certain extent. They are also aspiring. They want to get inspired also. And there are all these kind of influences which are going on. If you remember the CAA protest movement, the Kisan agitation, all these are offshoots which a lot of people feel were actually to that extent triggered by the deep state. So this is the threat. This is the challenge which is there in front of India. I'll conclude this podcast by once again kind of saying that a part of me never really believed of this about this deep state so much, but since I've been reading more commentary, I've been listening to policymakers, as I said, like Jeffrey Sachs, John Mearsheimer, it does appear that, of course, there are undercurrents in every administration. These undercurrents sometimes take the form of the deep state, which is very much there, and sometimes good comes out of these things, but usually it's always the darker side which emerges, the bad side which emerges, and therefore we really have to watch out for. And finally, to conclude, would the Prime Minister take up this issue with President Biden? Again, I'm not too sure, but if it happens, then we will see, and then we will talk about that if that really happens. And so on this note, I come to the end of this particular podcast. I hope you really enjoyed it, and if you like the show, of course, subscribe to us. Until next time, it's goodbye and cheers from my end.